All right, welcome in everyone to another deep dive. This time we're looking at the world of podcasting in India. I know a lot of you out there are interested in the opportunities this market presents. So we're going to be taking a look at a document today from Digital Gaurav Podcast Consultancy Services. Now, full disclosure, this is a promotional document, but we're going to cut through the hype and try to get to the real insights about what's going on in India. And luckily, I've got an expert here to help me make sense of it all.
Happy to be here.
Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's go.
All right. So one of the things that really surprised me reading through this was the potential. I mean, I knew podcasting was popular, but this report really highlights some serious business opportunities. What's your take on that?
Yeah. It really highlights the entrepreneurial spirit. That seems to be driving the growth of podcasting in India. And it's interesting because it goes beyond just the individual benefits. Like you were saying, there are some serious business applications emerging. You think about it, India has a massive and young population, most of whom have smartphones and internet access. I mean, that's a huge audience. And they're not just passively listening. They're engaging with content. They're spending money.
Right. So we've got a large engaged audience, but I mean, isn't that true of a lot of places? What makes India unique?
Well, it's a combination of factors, I think. So first, unlike maybe some more mature markets, podcasting in India is still relatively new. So that means that there's a lot more room for growth and innovation.
Yeah.
Especially if you can kind of tap into those cultural nuances.
Yeah.
Second, India has this very strong tradition of oral storytelling. Think about all the epics and folk tales that have been passed down for generations. And that translates really beautifully to the audio format.
Right.
It makes podcasts a natural fit for Indian audiences.
That makes a lot of sense. I can already see how powerful that connection to storytelling could be. So you've got this massive audience, this love of storytelling. And what else?
Rising disposable income.
Yeah.
People have more money to spend on entertainment and education.
Right.
And then you layer on top of that the fact that traditional media in India can be very fragmented, with different languages and regional preferences. And podcasts offer a way to kind of cut through all of that and reach specific audiences with targeted content. I mean, it's kind of a perfect storm of opportunity.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like podcasting in India is kind of like the Wild West right now. Wide open space, ton of potential, anyone who's willing to stake their claim. Am I on the right track?
You are definitely picking up on the key themes here. It is a very exciting time to be involved in Indian podcasting.
Yeah.
Especially if you can bring something unique to the table. But remember, while the potential is enormous, you need to understand the landscape. It's not just about replicating what works in other markets.
Speaking of unique, the report mentions Digital Gaurav, helping their clients gain thousands of listeners. Now, we don't have any specific examples, but it's heard. What does that tell us about the reach podcasting can have in India?
Well, it's a promising indicator. I mean, thousands of listeners might not sound like a lot in a global context, but in a rapidly growing market like India, it demonstrates that these podcasts can gain traction quickly, especially if they resonate with the cultural context and offer something valuable to the audience. Now, as you mentioned, without specific case studies, it's hard to analyze their strategies. But what we can take away is that building an engaged audience is definitely achievable.
Okay, so you've definitely piqued my interest, and I'm sure our listener is intrigued as well. Let's say someone's ready to jump into this booming market. What kind of business opportunities are we talking about? The report mentions a few.
It does. And what's exciting is it goes beyond the obvious entertainment route. There's a real demand for educational and informational content in India. Think about podcasts for language learning or professional development, even corporate training. It's a much more engaging and accessible way to deliver that information compared to traditional methods, especially in a country as vast and diverse as India.
That's a good point, especially with so many people on the move. Podcasts are perfect for learning on the go. I'm curious, are there any specific examples of how businesses are using podcasts in India?
Absolutely. Now, while the report doesn't get into specific case studies, we are seeing companies leveraging podcasts for things like internal communications, employee training, even just to reach potential customers. It's a very cost-effective way to build brand awareness and create a sense of community.
Okay, so we got training, internal comms, and reaching new customers. What about the more traditional ways to generate revenue from a podcast? Things like sponsorships and premium subscriptions.
Yeah, those models are definitely present in India, and we're seeing them implemented very successfully. Think about a podcast that focuses on, say, Bollywood films. They could secure sponsorships from streaming services. or film production companies, or, a personal finance podcast could partner with, investment platforms or financial institutions. It's all about finding the right fit between the podcast content and the brand's target audience.
So it's not just about throwing any old ad in there. It needs to be relevant and engaging for the listeners.
Exactly. It's about adding value for everyone involved, the podcast, the brand, and most importantly, the listener.
This is all incredibly interesting, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more. But before we get too deep into the specifics, let's pause here for now and pick up the conversation in part 2. See you there.
Welcome back. Really eager to continue our exploration of Indian podcasting.
Me too. We were just starting to get into the nitty-gritty of how podcasts can actually make money in India. You mentioned sponsorships and premium subscriptions. Are those the main revenue streams over there?
Those are definitely two big ones. But it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. It really depends on the type of podcast, the audience, and the creator's goals. Some podcasters in India, they focus on building a large following and then leverage that influence to secure lucrative brand deals and sponsorships.
So kind of like how influencers work on other social media platforms?
Precisely. It's about building that strong personal brand and a loyal community. Others might choose to focus on creating high-quality niche content and then offer premium subscriptions for exclusive access or bonus features.
Makes sense, like creating a membership community.
Yeah.
Where people are paying for extra value and a deeper connection.
Exactly. And then you have those who combine various approaches. Maybe they have sponsors for some episodes, offer premium content for paid subscribers, and also sell merchandise or other products related to their podcast.
Wow, so there's a whole ecosystem developing around podcasting in India. It's not just about creating content, it's about building a business.
That's a great way to put it. And what's exciting is that this ecosystem is still in its early stages. There's so much room for experimentation and innovation. It's a great time to be a podcaster in India, especially if you're entrepreneurial and willing to think outside the box.
Okay, so let's say our listener is convinced and they're ready to launch their own podcast in India. What advice would you give them? Where should they even begin?
First and foremost, I'd say, find your niche. What unique perspective or expertise can you bring to the table? What stories can you tell that will resonate with an Indian audience? Remember, you don't need fancy equipment or a huge budget to get started. The most important thing is to have a clear vision and a passion for your topic.
That's good advice. It's easy to get caught up in the technical aspects.
Yeah.
But the heart of any good podcast is the content.
Absolutely. Once you have a solid idea, think about your target audience. Who are you trying to reach? What are their interests and needs? What kind of content will they find valuable and engaging? This is crucial, especially in a diverse market like India.
So it's about tailoring your podcast to a specific group of people, rather than trying to appeal to everyone.
Exactly. The more specific you can be with your niche and your target audience, the easier it will be to create content that resonates and build a loyal following.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I know we talked about language earlier. Is it essential to podcast in Hindi or another regional language to succeed in India?
It's not necessarily essential, but it's definitely something to consider. If your target audience primarily speaks a regional language, then podcasting in that language can be a huge advantage. It shows that you understand their culture and that you're making an effort to connect with them on a personal level.
So for someone who's not fluent in Hindi or another regional language, what options do they have?
There are a few approaches they could take. They could collaborate with someone who's fluent in the target language, either as a co-host or a translator. They could also focus on creating content in English for the large English-speaking population in India.
So there's flexibility there. It's about finding the approach that best aligns with your skills and your target audience.
Precisely. And don't forget about the power of subtitles and transcripts. These can make your podcast accessible to a wider audience, even those who may not be fluent in the spoken language.
That's a great point. It's all about removing barriers and making your content as accessible as possible.
Exactly. Now, once you have your content and your language sorted, the next hurdle is getting your podcast out there in front of people. And that's where marketing and promotion come in.
Right. You could have the best podcast in the world, but if nobody knows about it, what's the point? So how do you effectively market a podcast in India? It's a huge country with so many different platforms and channels.
It can definitely feel overwhelming, but the key is to be strategic. Leverage social media platforms like YouTube, Instagram, even WhatsApp to share snippets of your podcast. Engage with potential listeners. Build a community around your content.
So it's not just about posting a link to your podcast and hoping people will click. It's about creating engaging content that will pique people's interest and make them want to listen.
Exactly. Think about creating short video clips, behind-the-scenes glimpses, or even interactive polls or quizzes related to your podcast. Get creative and have fun with it.
I love that. It's about making the marketing itself entertaining and informative. What about collaborating with other podcasters or influencers? Is that a good strategy in India?
Absolutely. Collaborations are a fantastic way to cross-promote your podcast and reach new audiences. Look for podcasters or influencers who have a similar target audience or who cover topics that complement your own.
So it's about finding those strategic partnerships that can benefit both parties and expand your reach.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of word-of-mouth marketing. Encourage your listeners to share your podcast with their friends, family, and colleagues.
It's the oldest form of marketing, but it's still one of the most effective, especially when it comes from a trusted source.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, marketing is an ongoing process. You need to consistently promote your podcast, engage with your audience, and find new ways to reach potential listeners. It's not a one-time effort. It's about building a long-term strategy.
So it's like tending a garden. You need to plant the seeds, nurture them, and then watch them grow.
That's a beautiful analogy. And just like a garden, your podcast will flourish with consistent care and attention.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. From understanding the unique opportunities in India to practical advice on creating, marketing, and monetizing a podcast. Before we move on to the final part, is there anything else our listeners should keep in mind as they embark on their podcasting journey?
Yes, there's one crucial piece of advice I want to emphasize. Be authentic. Share your unique voice, your perspective, and your passion. Don't be afraid to experiment and find what works best for you and your audience. And most importantly, have fun with it. Podcasting should be an enjoyable experience, both for you and your listener.
I love that advice. It's a great reminder that podcasting at its core is about sharing your passion and connecting with others.
Exactly. And in a vibrant and diverse market like India, there's no limit to the connections you can make and the impact you can have.
Well said. We've got one more part to go in this deep dive, so stick around as we explore even more exciting aspects of Indian podcasting. See you soon. All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Indian podcasting. We've covered a lot of ground, market opportunities to monetization strategies, but I kind of want to circle back to something we touched on earlier, this idea of cultural relevance. I know it's important, but what does it actually look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's easy to talk about in theory, but putting it into action requires a little more nuance. It's about going beyond just translating your content and really thinking about how to connect with Indian listeners on a deeper level.
So it's not enough to just take like an existing podcast and dub it in Hindi.
Not quite. While language is definitely a factor, it's just one piece of the puzzle. Think about it this way. India has this rich tapestry of cultures, traditions, and perspectives. So a podcast that resonates in Mumbai might not have the same impact in Chennai.
Okay, so how do you make sure your podcast speaks to those different cultural contexts?
One approach is to incorporate elements of Indian culture into your content. Think about weaving in stories from Indian mythology, history, or folklore. So, for example, if you're doing a podcast about leadership, you could draw parallels to figures like Mahatma Gandhi or Shivaji Maharaj. Or if you're discussing entrepreneurship, you could share stories of successful Indian businesses and the lessons they offer.
That's a great idea. It's about finding those relatable touchstones that'll resonate with Indian listeners. What about humor? Is that something to consider?
Absolutely. Humor is such a powerful tool for connection, but it's also highly culturally specific. So what might be considered funny in one culture might fall completely flat in another. So it's really important to understand the nuances of Indian humor, the wordplay, the observational comedy, even that kind of self-deprecating style that's popular here.
Yeah, so it's not about forcing in jokes that feel out of place. It's about understanding what makes Indian listeners laugh and incorporating those elements organically.
Exactly. It's about authenticity, and that goes beyond just humor. It's about being genuine in your approach, respecting cultural sensitivities, and avoiding stereotypes.
Makes sense. Are there any specific cultural sensitivities that podcasters should be aware of when creating content for an Indian audience?
Well, India is a diverse country with a wide range of beliefs and values. So it's important to be mindful of religious sensitivities, social customs, even political viewpoints. Do your research, be respectful of different perspectives, and when in doubt, err on the side of caution.
Right? So it's about being informed and thoughtful, not just about the content itself, but about how it might be perceived by different audiences within India.
Precisely. It's about approaching your podcast with a sense of cultural humility and a willingness to learn and adapt.
This has been incredibly insightful. I feel like we've really gone beyond the surface level here and delved into the heart of what it takes to create a podcast. That truly resonates with Indian listeners. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want to leave our listener with?
I would say, don't be afraid to embrace the challenge. Creating a culturally relevant podcast for India might require you to step outside of your comfort zone, to learn new things, to be open to different perspectives. But that's where the magic happens. That's where you create something truly special, something that connects with people on a deeper level and leaves a lasting impact.
That's a powerful message, and I think it applies not just to podcasting in India, but to any creative endeavor, really. It's about embracing the unknown, pushing our boundaries, and ultimately creating something that is both meaningful and impactful.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe your podcast will be the one that sparks a movement, inspires a generation, or simply brightens someone's day.
Yeah.
The possibilities are truly endless.
Well, on that inspiring note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of Indian podcasting. We explored the opportunities, the challenges, and the nuances of creating content that resonates with this vibrant and diverse market. I hope you found this journey as insightful and inspiring as I have. Remember, the world of podcasting is waiting for your unique voice and your story. So go out there, create something amazing, and share it with the world. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.